People-pleasing is not a personality type. It's not a communication style. It's not even a habit in the way habits are usually described. It is a survival strategy, one that was so effective for so long that it began to replace the person running it. And the reason that reframe matters, the reason it's not just a nicer way of saying the same thing, is that survival strategies don't respond to willpower. You don't decide your way out of something your nervous system learned was keeping you safe. What this video is going to do is show you the actual mechanism. Not the behavior, the mechanism underneath it. What it installed, what it cost, and what is quietly becoming possible now that the system that was running it is starting to change. It usually starts early, not with a single event, with a pattern of feedback. The girl who softened her opinion in the room relaxed. The girl who said yes when she meant no and got warmth in return. The girl who learned through repetition that her approval was contingent on her agreeableness, and that disapproval felt like something closer to danger than it probably should have. None of this was dramatic. That's the point. It was quiet, incremental, entirely logical given the environment she was learning to navigate. The brain is extraordinarily efficient at this. When a behavior produces safety and connection repeatedly, it doesn't stay a choice, it becomes a default. And eventually, below the threshold of conscious decision, it becomes what feels like personality. This is how a coping strategy becomes an identity. Not because she was weak, because she was adaptive, because the learning worked. So here's the question that doesn't get asked often enough. What happens when the person who has been centering everyone else for 20, 30, 40 years tries to locate what she wants and finds the question returns empty? Not because there's nothing there. Because the neural pathway that leads to her own preferences has been so lightly traveled for so long that finding it requires more than just deciding to want things. It requires relearning that wanting for herself is not, in fact, dangerous at all, and that relearning doesn't happen in a weekend. It happens in the accumulation of small moments where she chooses herself, and the world does not end. Now, here's the part that most conversations about people-pleasing leave out entirely. And it matters. Specifically for women in midlife. In the early 2000s, researchers at UCLA proposed something that quietly shifted how stress responses in women are understood. The established model, fight or flight, had been built almost entirely on studies of men. What the research on women kept showing was something different. Under stress, women are more likely to tend and befriend, to protect through nurturing, to manage threat through social cohesion, to keep the peace, to smooth the environment, to make sure everyone around them is okay. And the biological amplifier for this drive? Estrogen. Estrogen doesn't create the tend and befriend response, but it amplifies it significantly, which means that for the decades of a woman's reproductive life, the years when she was building the family, the marriage, the career, she was running a people-pleasing drive that had both a psychological layer and a hormonal layer. The conditioning she absorbed in childhood, and the chemistry that turned the volume up on it. This is not an excuse. It doesn't need to be. It is an explanation. And explanations change things, not because they remove responsibility, but because they remove the wrong kind of blame. Because here is what this means for perimenopause. As estrogen fluctuates and declines, the biological instruction to tend, to smooth, to orient around others begins to soften. Not disappear, soften. And for a lot of women, this is experienced as something going wrong. The patience she used to have, gone. The tolerance for being last, gone. The ability to suppress her own needs without much friction, gone. She goes to her doctor. She gets a hormone panel. Sometimes she gets a prescription. What she almost never gets is this. The compliance drive that was running on estrogen is loosening. And underneath it, for the first time in decades, there is a woman who is starting to hear herself again. That is not a symptom. That is the precondition for everything that comes next. But before we get to what comes next, something needs to be said about what the decades actually cost. Because the tend and befriend drive doesn't just shape behavior. Over time, over years of overriding preference, silencing desire, deferring judgment, editing opinions mid-sentence, it reshapes the internal architecture of a person. Research on chronic self-suppression, the consistent pattern of overriding internal states to maintain external harmony, shows a consistent finding. It doesn't just exhaust the person. It progressively weakens the neural pathways that generate preference in the first place. The question, "What do I want?" is not rhetorical. For a woman who has spent decades asking it last or not asking it at all, the question becomes genuinely difficult to answer, not because she is broken, because the circuitry that answers it has been systematically underused. This is the mechanism underneath the midlife void, not a character deficiency, not ingratitude, not hormones. Decades of a system that learned to route everything outward, to other people's needs, other people's comfort, other people's timelines, and somewhere in that routing, her own signal got quieter and quieter until she could barely locate it. And the void that so many women in midlife describe, the hollow feeling in the paper-perfect life, the strange sense of being a visitor in your own existence. That void is not the absence of a self. It is the first moment of silence long enough to hear the one that was always there. She didn't disappear, she got routed around. For years. By a system she didn't design, running on an instruction her biology was amplifying, inside a set of social arrangements that benefited from her being available and agreeable, and endlessly oriented outward. The want didn't leave. The pathway to it narrowed. And what perimenopause is doing, beneath all the disruption, beneath all the loss, is widening that pathway again. If this opens something, if the mechanism makes sense, but undoing it in real daily life feels like a different problem entirely, there is something in the description built exactly for that. It's a 30-day practice designed to rebuild, slowly and specifically, the internal authorization to want things for herself. Not through dramatic change, through accumulation. The same way the pattern installed in small repeated acts, it can be interrupted. The link is in the description and in the pinned comment. So what does the exit from this actually look like? Not, and this is important, the dramatic rupture she probably fears. Not the resignation, the confrontation, the blow-up that finally says everything she's been suppressing for years. That version of the exit is what happens when the pressure has been building too long with no release valve. The actual exit looks quieter than that. It looks like learning the difference between two things that are usually collapsed into the same conversation. Boundary setting is external. It's about what she will and won't accept from others. Preference recovery is internal. It's about rebuilding the capacity to know what she wants before anyone else's needs enter the room. Most of the work she's been advised to do has been about the external layer. Set limits, communicate needs, say no, and she may have tried this and hit a wall of internal resistance she couldn't fully explain because the resistance wasn't about skill or courage. It was about the fact that the internal layer hadn't been rebuilt yet. You can't communicate preferences you haven't recovered the ability to feel. This is why perimenopause, as disorienting as it is not only a loss. The biological compulsion to orient around others is softening. The nervous system's hair trigger for social disapproval is becoming slightly less immediate. The internal voice that asks, "But what will they think?" is losing some of its authority. Not all of it, not quickly, but enough, if she is paying attention, to create small windows. Windows where she can hear, briefly, what she actually thinks, what she actually wants, what she would actually choose if choosing for herself felt as natural as choosing for everyone else. The work is not to seize those windows and immediately act on everything inside them. The work is to notice them, to stay in them a moment longer than she normally would, to practice the tolerance for her own desire before it immediately gets evaluated against everyone else's comfort. That is not a dramatic change. It is not a rupture. It is what the return looks like when it is being done without destroying what she built. If today named something you want to go further with, the resource in the description is the daily practice version of this work, built for real life, without requiring a dramatic change to it. Link in the description and the pinned comment. When did you first notice that you didn't know what you wanted? Not for anyone else, just for yourself. What do you think that moment was actually telling you? So here is what to leave with today. Not a plan, not a next step. Just this. People-pleasing is not who you are. It is what you learned to do inside a set of conditions that rewarded it, and inside a biology that was amplifying the drive to do it. Both of those things are true. Both of those things matter. And neither of them is a verdict on your character. What the decades cost, the preferences overridden, the desires deferred, the internal voice that learned to wait until everyone else had been taken care of, that cost is real. And it is allowed to be grieved, not because she did anything wrong, because something was lost in increments, so quietly, so reasonably, that no one called it a loss. But here's the other thing that is also true. The void she's been living inside, The hollow, at the center of the assembled life, is not the absence of a person. It is the silence that appears when the compliance machinery finally runs out of fuel. And in that silence, if she stays in it long enough, instead of immediately filling it with the next obligation, she will begin to hear something. Faint at first. Unfamiliar. The specific frequency of what she actually wants. What she actually thinks. Who she actually is when no one needs anything from her. That signal was never gone. It was never erased. It was routed around for a very long time by a system that had very good reasons for keeping the traffic moving in another direction. The system is changing now, not because something went wrong, because something is finally allowed to surface. That is not a rupture. That is the return.